So anyway, so my name is Aaron Prestes. I'm the Director of Payments for LexisNexis Risk Solutions. And this is our 8th True Cost of Fraud study. It's an annual study. I'm sure a lot of you have probably seen it in previous years. We made some significant changes to it this year, not the least of which is we're launching it in the spring instead of in the fall. And that's something I've been pushing for a while. One of the reasons is because I wanted to share this information with you earlier in the year so that you can actually act on it before you lock down your systems for the holiday season. All right, I'm sure. All right, just quick show of hands. How many merchants do we have in the room? Just want to see. Do we have any payment processors? Oh, God, yeah, there you go. Okay, so I'll try and speak to everybody. All right, so let's jump right in. The True Cost of Fraud study. Why do we do that? We want to help merchants grow their business without growing the risk of fraud, right? As you grow your business, fraud has a funny way of creeping in. And actually, there's a lot of evidence of this, that the bigger you get, the more fraud you deal with disproportionately. But really, we want to help you grow your business, manage the cost of fraud, at the same time, not turning your fraud department into the sales prevention department. All right, we want you to figure out how can the fraud department really be about sales enablement, about saying yes to transactions, about being confident about the decisions that you're making. So the study this year, comprehensive survey, 1,007, so just over 1,000 risk and fraud executives in various retail organizations. So that's a pretty big sample. We make an effort to have it be representative of the industry. In places where it may be a little off, we do some weighting. We have some statistical heavy lifting that gets done to try and keep this as accurate and true to the industry as we can. Some quick definitions here. So we're really talking about fraudulent transactions, requests for refund. What we're not talking about is things like insider fraud, so that does not get covered here. And so how we've spaced out the merchant definition: small up to $1 million, medium 1 to 50 million annual sales, and that's online, and large 50 million online. Now we break out in a few places m-commerce merchants, so those are merchants who identified themselves as having a mobile channel. Now, one thing I like to say is that if you're online, you have a mobile channel, whether you've optimized for it or not. But these are organizations that have self-identified themselves as having optimized for that. That's important. And just to put a little more color on large e-commerce, in order to qualify for that, you have to do at least 50 million of your sales online, and have that represent at least 10 million of your 10% of your sales. Sorry. All right, so let's jump right into the findings. I've got to let you know I'm probably going to talk fast. There's a lot of data here and not that much time. You have the report published in front of you, and of course I'm always available to answer questions. So, key findings. Retail fraud continues to rise dramatically, as does its cost. Does that surprise anybody? Good. I didn't think that would. And we'll get into sort of what we really saw, or sort of dig into that a little more. Large remote channel merchants, that being e-commerce, card not present, are where that fraud increases. So we looked across channels, including in-store, and we're really seeing that, yes, CNP fraud is rising faster than in-store fraud. Mobile fraud is the somewhat bigger issue and can be expected to grow. So when we look at, again, kind of looking at those different channels, how things are coming in, what we're finding is that mobile fraud, which was always somewhat larger of a problem, sort of as we've been looking at this over the past few years, but that channel is the fraud in that channel is growing with disproportionate speed. And at the same time, as more and more merchants move to optimize for the mobile channel, they're finding themselves increasingly challenged in that channel. Merchants track fraud costs by payment channel or payment method, but not often both. And we'll kind of get into some of the implications of that and sort of why we called that out. International remote merchants need to understand which solutions are best for their transactions. International, as we all know, is a big challenge. Identity overseas is a challenge. IP addresses start becoming difficult. Buyer behavior is different. And so what we found is that merchants who sell internationally have additional challenges, and we'll kind of dig into that a little more as well. while merchants do spend on fraud mitigation, they need to be convinced of the effectiveness of their solutions. So this gets kind of into the attitudes of the merchants, viewing fraud prevention as a necessary evil as opposed to something that really helps to drive the bottom line. And a lot of the numbers that came out of that were actually a little surprising when you start to look at those attitudes and ways that maybe the tools that are in place can be better optimized or other tools can be added to really enhance the value of those. And the last one, merchants benefit more when relying on a multi-layered approach. So, I talked about sort of what's the optimal combination, right? We would never suggest that you use just identity management, you use just behavior analysis, use just device fingerprinting, right? Each of those has its own place. When layered together and used in a smart, risk-adjusted way, you really get a much more effective system and stronger impact. So, general trends indicate a growing problem with retail fraud, right? Is that right? It's kind of blunt, isn't it? There's nothing flowery. There's no marketing language to that. That's a fact. So let's look at what that means. So the LexisNexis fraud multiplier, and this is sort of the keystone, as you can see, the trademarked way that we talk about fraud at LexisNexis. And so you can see we've done this over the years. And what that's really saying is, what is the total hit to the bottom line of a fraud event? If you lose a $100 piece of merchandise, what does that actually end up costing you, right? And that adds in costs like payment processing costs, chargeback fees, lost logistics fees, right? You're not getting a refund from your delivery company. And in many cases, it includes merchandise replacement, right? That thing is no longer on the shelf. I no longer have the opportunity to make a profit on that. I have inventory costs to return that product to inventory so I can eventually make the money on it that I expected to. And when you add all that stuff up, this year that number comes to $2.40, which is a slight rise from last year. Now, last year we saw that big drop there, and that drop wasn't because fraud went down. It was actually the opposite. It was because the number of fraud incidences went up so high that those costs got spread across more transactions. This year, things sort of moved a little more in lockstep. And so while the change isn't significant, the fact that it's still there actually indicates that we're still spreading a lot of fraud over a lot of transactions. Right? And we'll get into sort of the volumes here. Right? Oh, right now, right? So the volume of fraud transactions. So you can see that number going up. And I think I want you to pay attention more to the sort of the direction of it than the absolute numbers. Of course, these are averages. But when you start looking at the volume of fraud transactions growing and the fraudulent attempts versus successful fraud, right? That's sort of an odd thing to say, right? But how often were the fraudsters successful, right? And how that ratio changes over time, right? And it just keeps going up, right? And that the jump this year in the number of attempts went up, and also that average transaction value, that was actually a real surprise. Jumped from $113 per loss to $146 per loss. That's a big increase, right? And then the other number here on this slide is the percent of revenue lost to fraud. So last year, when that number jumped up to 1.32, that was pretty shocking, right? When you started hitting that more than 1% of revenue lost to fraud, that's sort of like a mental milestone, right? And if you think about it, like, does anybody here manage their chargebacks, right? And you understand, what happens if your chargebacks exceed 1% of sales, right? Well, your fraud losses, sorry? Yes, you go to chargeback jail, right? Right. So I mean, this isn't saying that that's that in terms of your sort of per network losses are there, but sort of your total loss has exceeded that 1% mark, and it continued to go up this year. I was actually kind of hopeful that maybe last year was a bit of an anomaly and that revenue loss to fraud would go down, but it didn't. It went up again. As I said, general trends indicate increasing problem. And then this part was particularly interesting, right? When you look at where the fraud is occurring, so it's not just remote channel card not present, it's the larger multi-channel merchants that are getting hit the hardest, right? So when you look at sort of the percentage of successful fraud there, right, among those larger merchants, right, they're really taking it on the chin. And so then the question becomes why, and that's why we sort of called out there the fact that they are multi-channel, right? The larger an organization is, the more paths there are in, the more complexity there is to their environment, the more potential windows of opportunity there are for the fraudsters. And so as you add in-store pickup, buy online, pick up in store. Anybody use the term BOPIS around here? Yeah, I love that. So as you get buy online, pick up in store, as you get mobile, as you get sort of order online, pick up, order mobile, pick up in store, right? I mean, whoever thought that fast food places would be card not present merchants, right? But have you ever ordered a burrito on your phone and picked it up? Right? That's an exposure that that restaurants didn't think they ever would have, and now now they do. Now are they getting more customers or conversion? They might be, but it's sort of an interesting angle. And so, but the bigger you are, the more likely you are to have those additional channels, and those channels do enable more fraud. So this kind of reinforces that point and then adds in the concept of international. So when you start going international, right, the larger you are, the more likely you are to sell internationally, or at least deliberately sell internationally. Again, if you're online, there's a good chance that you're selling internationally, even if you're delivering to reshippers. So that adds an additional level of complexity, and that drives sort of additional losses. And then we talked about mobile. So we don't often make a lot of predictions about things that are going to happen, but one thing that we did notice here was not only does mobile create an opportunity for fraud, but more and more merchants are committing to the mobile channel, right? They said that they are considering m-commerce, right? The ones who currently allow, or as I said, really that means currently optimized for. They have an app, they have a mobile optimized site, they're deliberately in the mobile channel, versus those who are considering, right? And so you see these blue bars and how many more merchants, particularly in this sort of mid-size area here, who are saying, yeah, we're thinking about going mobile, right? And so, like I said, we don't often predict things, but it does appear that as that happens, we do see a lot more risk there, and that's one of the reasons why we do this. You want to communicate, give people foreknowledge to understand. If you're going to go into the mobile channel, you need to understand buyer behavior is different, risk signals are different. Your fraud models may not work as effectively in that channel, and you need to be prepared to optimize for them as you add new channels. So what kinds of fraud? This one, important to notice on this slide, these are not time series, these are different channels, but sort of where what types of fraud occur in the different channels. I'm always astonished by this one, by friendly fraud. 31% going to friendly fraud, that's a lot, right? It gives me a certain amount of pain to know that people are deliberately doing this. Like I have trouble that human nature allows that many people to deliberately buy things and then say, nope, didn't buy it, but it does happen quite a bit. I personally believe that some of this is tied up in what is often called clean fraud. It's fraud where the identities have been so thoroughly compromised that the merchant just says that had to be friendly fraud. There's no way, everything else added up. But you've got identity theft, and you can see sort of where the channels are, that's a big problem. Large e-commerce, fraudulent requests for returns. Now a lot of that happens. That grows particularly in with buy online, pick up in store, with multi-channel, allowing in-store returns of e-commerce merchandise. Of course, lost or stolen, and you can see sort of where that's a bigger problem, right? In physical point of sale, things tend to walk out of the store in terms of shrinkage. But interesting to see sort of where the distribution is. Debit card fraud is on the rise. So this is actually a 2-year trend. We picked this up last year. Debit cards used to be somewhat ignored by the fraud community. The open to buy isn't as big. Consumers tend to notice more when where there's a compromise. But what we're seeing is that when there is a large-scale breach, you actually tend to lose more debit cards than credit cards, depending on what it is, because they get used more often. Depends on where the breach was. But now the fraudsters are saying, you know what, there's money out there. I'll take it, right? And furthermore, I believe that this may be driven at some level by the shift to EMV, right? Fewer cards available for easy counterfeiting. So maybe there's $500 in that checking account. I'm a fraudster. I'll take it. So interesting to see how that happens, and then sort of where the channels are where that's been an issue. Okay, so what's the reaction to these trends, right? So it's all gloom and doom, right? Fraud is worse. It's in every channel, complexity. So online and mobile channel merchants, so they worry about what are the things that keep them up at night? What are the biggest challenges, right? And so this one, verification of customer identity, right? That's the one that really, you talk to fraud departments, what's the number one thing you try and do? We try and verify addresses. Try and make sure, does that person really live there? Verify the identity in some of this, right? And that's the biggest challenge they have. They say that over and over. Confirmation of package delivery, right? I think that speaks largely to friendly fraud. How do we know that it actually got delivered? And that, frankly, it didn't get stolen off your porch, right? Does that happen? Somebody gave me the term porch pirates to describe this. This is a growing problem, right? And it's driving sales of in-home security cameras. It seems like every week on the news, have you seen this person? It's a jogger that stole something off somebody's porch. But again, so getting back to that customer identity, right? That's what people are really challenged with, and that surprises me because we have lots of tools to do that, right? And it's not just ours, right? Establishing that is, that's one of the things that we feel like we've got a pretty good handle on. And then what does that do, right? This one I thought was a really interesting insight. So we did some real deep crosstabs, and we looked at, okay, what happens, what do the merchants who are really concerned about verifying customer identity do, right? And what they do is they do a lot of manual reviews, right? If they say verification of customer identity is a top problem, right, they do a lot more manual reviews, right? So you do get this sort of cause and effect. What you care about, what you think is a problem, drives behavior, drives the way your fraud department works. And that was, I thought, a really key finding. So this is something that's actually been true for a number of years. So the large CNP merchants, they recognize that it's important to manage fraud. There are some benefits to it, but they say it costs too much, right? So managing fraud increases customer loyalty. Yeah, they believe that. Can help increase sales, yep, but it still costs too much, right? And can you imagine a marketing person saying it costs too much to increase sales and increase customer loyalty, right? Right, but the fraud people get that feedback. They're like, you guys are a cost center. You're not helping things out. You're preventing sales. And it's the mobile channel that really creates the most. And here's something that I also find interesting. So if you look at, right, need to remain competitive, somewhat important, helps grow the business important, but they still have these big securities around the mobile device and the understanding that mobile payment adds to fraud. So here you've got the risk people saying, be really careful. And then you've got the marketing and sales people going, we're going to do this. Right? So you get that disconnect again, right? And that kind of gets back to how do you demonstrate the value of your organization? And it's by making them aware that as you go down that road, you need to understand what can be done, and then you as the fraud department need to understand that there are things that you can do to help mitigate that risk as the marketing department goes that direction. So what do we do about this growing problem? So the large remote merchants, right, these large CNPs, and a lot of this data is going to sort of concentrate on them because we have the best data on them. So they are more likely to combine auto flagging and fraud mitigation, right? So that some sort of case management tool with some of the more discrete methods, right? So if you see who's doing what, right? So you've got this fraud mitigation solution here versus automated flagging, and the difference, right? Small and mid, right? So they're not using it as often as they're using just these kind of basic solutions, and this really speaks to mostly ABS and CVV, the stuff that kind of comes by default. I'm often surprised when we get these surveys back, just kind of as an aside, how many merchants don't say they don't do ABS and CVV, right? I don't think I've ever bought anything online, except maybe from a nonprofit or a doctor's office, where they didn't ask for CVV. And maybe it's just a function of not understanding or not realizing that it's available by default. But then, what else do they add, right? But then as you get large, right, you're more likely to have sort of a platform or a case management system. And again, if you're international and you do E&M commerce. So larger remote merchants also take steps by tracking where the fraud originates, right? But not, so say, less than optimally, right? So this is one of the things I said earlier, right? So if we look at fraud costs by channel and costs by channel and transactions by channel, right? So these are two different things. And then, who does it both, right? So who does both of those things? And we would say you really should do both, right? You need to make sure that you understand your fraud cost by channel and payment method, right? So who does both? And then you need to understand the transaction itself, right? So costs and transaction by transaction, which is the distinction there. And then you can see, right, so by channel, by payment method, or do not track, right? So as you get bigger, right, very few do not tracks. More likely to have it by payment method, but not by channel, right? So again, that kind of gets back to the point where if you're not keeping track of what's coming in, particularly over the mobile channel, you're missing an opportunity to stop fraud. And you're missing an opportunity to enable sales, because you're going to be looking at that and saying, I'm not getting the information I normally would get because this is coming in over the mobile channel, and you're more likely to review it and you're more likely to reject it. But one thing that is somewhat heartening here is the number of total solutions. So I'll get into sort of what all these options are here on the next slide. But sort of as you, went too far. As you get bigger, you are more likely to implement more things. So here, online only 2.3, right? That's ABS, CVV, and maybe a little bit of something else tossed in. As you get a little bigger, you add them. And this is actually somewhat encouraging here, right? When you add m-commerce, in many cases, they're adding sort of one more solution. Now, hopefully that one more solution is mobile specific and helps them track. That's been, and this trend has been fairly consistent in terms of the number of solutions that merchants employ. And so one thing that we did this year was we really looked at, all right, well, so what are those, right? It's not just a number. Like, let's look at which are the combinations of things that are actually in use. And this is where things got a little surprising. So here you have CVV, geolocation, address verification. Now, some of these are creep in because we have a lot of multi-channel merchants in here. So, for example, you would not do PIN or signature authentication online, although you can. Nobody does, but you can. Or check verification, although you can do that if you accept ACH transactions. But then when you come over here to the things that, as someone who spent years in the payments and fraud industry, that I think of as the most effective solutions, the fact that the implementation of those is lagging is very surprising to me. I can't tell you how many times I've been either at this conference or at other fraud-focused conferences where people say things like, device ID and fingerprinting, that's like table stakes. Like, if you're not doing that, you are hugely exposed, right? And then you look at sort of the implementation, sort of what I know about the industry and the players and our partners in the industry that do this. It becomes sort of less of a surprise. Like, yeah, there's a lot of people who are leaving that opportunity on the table and by not implementing these solutions. Rules-based filters, quiz authentication. Not something you want to do on every transaction, but for certain high-risk transactions, right? Knowledge-based authentication, doing the quizzes, really making sure that person is who they say they are, hugely powerful. And then kind of getting back to what we were saying about manual reviews, right? So as you start looking at, what people do and what they spend their money on, right? When you look at kind of everything, right? It's about half the spend goes to those fraud prevention solutions, and then look how much spend goes to manual reviews, right? And I'm actually sort of curious, does this feel consistent to you? Are you spending 1/4 of your fraud prevention dollars on manual reviews? Maybe it's more, I don't know, but that sounds like a lot, right? And when you kind of go back to those solutions and how much more can be automated and how much more efficient you can make your manual review teams by either giving them more information up front or simply automating things that keep things out of the manual review queue. There's a lot of power there to knock that number down. And you may even decrease your overall spend on fraud, but increase your success rate and make better decisions. And so kind of getting back to those decisions, right? So here we are, the solutions may not be optimal. Right? Even with the automated systems, right, for these merchants, excessive manual reviews are one of the biggest challenges, right? That's the one that people are trying to knock down. Verification of consumer identity, right? These really sort of dovetail, right? The more manual reviews you do indicates, as we showed before, the more concerned you are about identity, and manual review is sort of it's the weak link, right? People are always the weak link, right? Think about social engineering, right? How do fraudsters get into banks, right? It's the call centers, right? So when you start putting people on the front line to make that decision, and either not giving them as much information as possible up front or not giving them the best tools with which to do that, you get a lot of errors. You get fraud that gets through, and you get what we call the insult rate, right? You get false positives. You say, I rejected a transaction, and that customer should not have been rejected. That was a legitimate transaction. It looked funny, but we didn't have enough tools to understand what made it look funny. So this is a comparison of domestic to international. So with international, you get a few different things: lack of specialized tools for international orders, new and varied payment methods, right? If any of you are selling overseas, you may have experienced that in certain markets, credit and debit cards are not the favorite way to buy things online, right? They like alternative payment methods. They like the domestic debit scheme. In some countries, it's cash, right? They go and they take vouchers down to convenience stores and they pay cash for things. Charge on delivery, COD, is popular in some countries, right? Which, I know a lot of domestic merchants say, are you kidding? But in many markets, if you want to play e-commerce, you have to allow for these types of things, and you have to create risk models that take that into account. And then there's little consensus about what is most effective for international fraud, right? So, what are the things that get used most? So we can kind of write that one off to the in-store channel, but CVV, it gets used. Browser malware tracking, not so much. AVS, hard to do in global markets. But other things that can be very powerful: authentication by quiz, geolocation, device ID, transaction scoring, transaction tracking, rule-based filters, right? These things don't get used as much as I would think they would in the international channel. And so when you kind of combine all those things and you look at sort of what are people then doing with their transaction, right? They're not bringing the best tools to bear. They're not putting them together in the best way. What happens is you end up doing, again, sort of a lot of manual reviews. And sort of the bottom line here is, and this actually dovetails with a couple other studies that have come out recently, that merchants review up to 25% of transactions, right? And even ones that are flagged, right? So here you've got these things that says, my rules engine, my decision management system says this is questionable. What do we then do with it? Well, about half of those get auto-decisioned. They either get accepted or rejected. And then the other half go to manual review. And the bottom line ends up being 25% of transactions end up in the manual queue. Now, I know if you're here, there's a pretty good chance that your number is lower, right? Because you're an organization that goes for the education, that participates in events like this, and maybe Merchant Risk Council, MRC, and those organizations do tend to have lower review rates, but they could still be lower. And then this kind of gets back to what I was saying before about false positives, right? So as you start pushing things through the process, right, the false positive rates continue to be a challenge, right? Declined transactions, which turned out to be false positives, right? And it's actually growing, right? As fraud grows, I mean, this I think may be the most powerful slide in the deck, right? As fraud grows, we become more careful about what we're doing. As we become more careful, we interpret that as a need to review more. And as we review more, we improperly reject more transactions. Does everybody follow that logic? Oh, and then just sort of to put a cherry on top of that, costs too much to control fraud, right? We're doing more of this expensive manual review, and we're saying it costs too much. Not a surprise. So what do we do about that? Well, so we looked at, again, we went back and we looked at the solutions that get used, which ones are really effective, which ones are the ones that the merchants say actually do the job for them. And what we found is that, really using this multi-layered, by putting things together, by not just saying, well, not just using one solution or the basic core solutions, which is kind of that collection over to the left on the previous slide. But as you get more solutions and you layer them together, right, you use the core solutions with identity, with transaction risk, that has a significant impact. All right, we've done test after test after test on this, both with our data and with partners. We say when you build into your risk model information about identity, information about device, information about site behavior, when you blend those things together, you get much more effective decisions. And you're not just stopping more fraud, you're allowing more good transactions. Okay? And that's really what I want you to come away with more than anything. You're not just stopping fraud, you're allowing more good transactions. Things that look funny, but when you dig into it and you really understand the underlying risk of all the signals that you're getting, you can say yes to more transactions. Right? And so we see how this plays out. Right? So when we look at fraud attempts that are successful and the merchants that use that multi-layered approach, right, look how much less fraud they experience. Right? The fraud rate per attempt is half. Right? So they're not just using rules. They're not just using device. They're not just using identity. They're putting these things together in a smart, risk-adjusted way that helps them really have an impact on the bottom line. So, recommendations. Track both payment and channel fraud. Right? And really, it's that channel fraud thing that I think is missing more often. Right? Understand that the way your customers come to you affects how they appear to your fraud system, affects the way that you need to look at that transaction and understand, is it good or not? What can I do about it? And changes the number of things that you look at, right? The information you get about a device is very different if the customer comes in mobile than if the customer comes in from a desktop. Right? The information is different if they're using your app than if they're on your website. Right? The information is different if they are picking it up in store. Right? So as you add different channels, you need to have different fraud views, fraud models, different rules, different thoughts about the process and the information that you bring to that transaction. So, actually, these two kind of come together, or maybe I just explained that one twice. Mobile need to remain vigilant and open to a wider variety of fraud solutions, right? So I think I may even have addressed that, right? So mobile takes away a certain amount of information, but it also makes available a certain amount of information. It's harder to get at that information, right? I think you hear a lot of the hype that says, oh, mobile will solve all of our identity problems, right? I don't think anybody in this room believes that's true, right? Because this is what we do for a living, right? But when you hear things like, oh, your device becomes your identity. Yes, if you do strong authentication at enrollment time, or you're confident that that's in the hand of the person you think it is, or you're doing geolocation and geofencing along with, right? So there's all these different things you have to bring together. You can't just say, oh, I checked out the mobile phone number and it's good, right? There's a lot more to be done. International merchants should complement their approach with unique additional things. So it's very hard to check international identity. It can be done at some levels, and in cases where it can't, there are other tools that you need to look at the IP address more carefully, understand the risk of the location, right? Certain countries, maybe it's harder to get the information there, but you have a better fraud experience there. And then what else do you add to that? Device is very, very effective in reducing fraud in the international channel. But again, where you can verify identity, you want to try to do that. And I think the thing I hammered home probably the most is the multi-layered approach, right? No one solution can do it all, and using them in serial is not really the right way to do it. You need to blend these things together. You need to build your risk models that pull those signals together into a cohesive decision, and you need to have different risk models for different modalities. And of course, the sales pitch time. Right? So we have solutions that can help with some of this. Now, I'll tell you, we don't do all of this. Right? We don't have solutions that do everything. Sometimes I say that we don't make your fraud solution, we make your fraud solution better, right? Actually, in some cases, we make your fraud solution. But so just kind of looking at some of what we do and what we have, right? Vast data resources. So I didn't just hammer on identity verification because it's something we're particularly good at. It's because it's so important, right? But we do have the most identity data of anybody, right? Test after test has proven this, right? We ask people to send us your no-hits on your current solution, and we'll find them. Big data technology. So we don't just have all that data, we tie it all together, right? So we have a proprietary platform called HPCC, which combines that big data technology and linking and analytics. So we've taken thousands and thousands of public record and proprietary information sources, and it's not just all in one big dump. It's all linked together. So everything that comes in about Aaron Press is linked to a single set of identity attributes, right? And so we can really look at identity history, we can look at identity risk factors, and we've modeled against this stuff so that it's not just, well, he lives there, but what does his address history say? How often does he move, right? And this isn't even credit line information, right? We don't do that. We're not a credit bureau, although we do help you with credit risk decisioning if any of you have that problem. And we do this in a way that's industry specific. So we have focused, particularly over the past 3 or 4 years, on helping solve this problem in retail and e-commerce. And so just some of the products, we have identity verification, validate name, address, and phone information. And sometimes that should really be verification and authentication, right? Verification is that information correct? Authentication is that information yours, right? And we try and help you do both. Make sure that, that's just, well, that person actually lives there, but that person lives there, that person lives there, and those people know each other. And there's a reason that somebody would be sending something there. Transaction risk scoring, right? So that kind of gets to looking at the risk factors that underlie the identities, not just the identity itself. Manual research support. So let me tell you, I hammered hard on manual reviews. I don't want you to stop doing manual reviews, right? We've actually had some merchants say, oh yeah, we want to stop doing manual reviews. I don't think you can tune your risk engine that well to get to 0 manual reviews. But then when you do the manual reviews, what data are you bringing to bear, right? How many of you use search engines to find people, right? And what is your no-hit rate going to be, right? I see smiles in the room. People are like, oh yeah, we do that, right? And again, that kind of gets back to what I said earlier, right? If you give us your no-hits, we'll find them. You give us, we had the wrong address for that person. We probably have the right one. And then, so we talked about authentication, right? Is that information yours, right? How do we know? Do we want to go through the trouble of knowledge-based authentication? Well, if it's a big transaction, somebody's buying a luxury watch, and you think it's a little fishy, you want to know they are who they say they are, because not selling it to them means leaving a lot of money on the table, right? So sometimes a little friction can go a long way to generating a lot of revenue.